Salutations from space and aloha from Earth. This is Gemini Brett of More Than Astrology and Gary Caton of Dream Astrologer here with episode 2 of Standing Rock Astrology. In the first episode, we shared our intentions and introduced ourselves a little bit. And today we're going to move into this chart that we've decided to use as the mundane or the world chart for Standing Rock, which is in Standing Rock, Dakota on April 29th, 1868, which was the date of the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. And we can speak more about what was going on historically, maybe another time. But today I want to get into the astrology a bit. So I'm going to close our cameras just for a second and show a bit of a decoder ring for those of you who don't know the glyphs and such. And I might, eventually we'll probably speak about these asteroids and about Eris as well. If you know the astrological glyphs, this is a strange glyph that this wonderful software Intrepid uses or used to use for Juno. Typically her glyph is an asterisk or a star on the cross of matter. But we'll put those in right now. Maybe you can take a screenshot, and here's the chart that we'll be using next to the decoder ring. All right, so now I'm back here, and I'm going to take away some of these asteroids for now. And in fact, we're going to talk about the whole chart here eventually, but I think it would be beautiful for us to start kind of piecemeal. And with all of this happening, I'm going to very much simplify this thing and break it down to just the sun and moon today. In fact, let's just start with the sun, the source of life, the light, great mystery itself. Stare too long and you go blind, the warmth that gives us life, yes? So Gary, could you please tell us about Taurus sun, and maybe even what's going on around the 10th degree of Taurus, where the sun was on April 29th, 1868?
Right. Well, this is the interface that is the most common ground for people when they first hear about their astrological chart, right? Most people know their sun sign. They know that to have the sun in Taurus means they were born somewhere between, April 20th and May 20th, 2021, thereabouts. And to put it more simply, it means they were born in the middle of spring, right? So the tropical zodiac is basically just the wheel of the sky divided into 12 equal pieces, 3 for each season. There's a beginning, a middle, and end to each season, right? Spring has a beginning, middle, and end. April showers are followed by May flowers, which are followed by June weddings, right? Everybody knows this experientially. They know that the weather changes, even not just from season to season, but from the beginning, middle, and end of the season. So what we're talking about here is middle spring. And what happens in middle spring? The earth becomes at its most abundantly fertile. Yeah, it's flowering. Everything is green. Everything is busting out with this wonderful energy, where the earth is showing that it's alive and it's ready to feed its children, right? So, wow, I mean, just think, assuming that this treaty had ever been honored, what a wonderful way to set the foundation for an indigenous people who make their living from the land, yeah? That there's no sign that reminds me of native way of life more than Taurus, because Taurus is the earth in its most fruitful aspect. And it's interesting that in classical astrology, the moon is said to be exalted in Taurus, the moon being basically symbolizing nurturing and feeding, for instance, and stuff. So that Taurus is the time of year when you plant your crops, right? Or farming people do anyways. There's a whole thing about that here where, the Lakota people were basically forced into being farmers at one point. But whether you're a farmer or a hunter-gatherer, the earth is in the same state of being at this point in time. It's mid-spring. Taurus is a fixed sign, being the middle part of a season. The cardinal signs begin a season. They sort of move the wheel of the year into a new season, so they're seen to be more forceful and motion oriented. The fixed sign is about holding the fruits of that season, right? So the flowers and the green trees and the wonderful energy of the earth beginning to show her fertility again. This is, for the Celtic people, this is what they called Beltane, right? The Celtic people celebrated the middle of spring as Beltane. It was often a fertility festival where people would literally make love in the fields. You know, the men and the women would join together to celebrate the fertility of the land and so forth.
Yeah, beautiful. Would love to add a couple things to that. One, so Gary's speaking about this being the middle of the spring season. And it's interesting, of course, for our sisters and brothers in the Southern Hemisphere, it's the middle of their autumn.
Right.
And so we will speak from the Northern Hemisphere point of view because that's our experience. Although I'd just love to honor both hemispheres, and like the prophecies of the eagle or up Northern Hemisphere and the condor, Southern Hemisphere. I mean, usually spoken of North America and South America, but really find in so many ways, and we'll probably see this throughout this series a bit, how when we honor both hemispheres, we actually really come to the middle way and bring balance. But I'm going to share the chart again and just add a couple of things to what Gary just taught us. And that is that when we're looking at spring in this way, the cardinal sign Aries, as Gary mentioned, this is spring equinox. So in the tropical astrological system, which is what we're talking about here, 0 Aries begins with vernal equinox. Yeah, in a way that's like the resurrection, when the sun's coming back from nights that are longer than days, and here that energy is changing in the Northern Hemisphere. So 0 Aries begins spring in the Northern Hemisphere. And 0 Cancer begins summer in the Northern Hemisphere. So this is summer solstice or June solstice, when the sun finds its way to 0 Cancer. Right in between the two is 15 degrees Taurus, and that is known as an astronomical cross quarter. And we celebrate Beltane these days, or nowadays it's what it's called May Day, on May 1st. Which is basically happening at this time. And really it's a cross-quarter holiday, like yesterday, as we're recording today on November 1st, 2016. Yesterday was what we now call Halloween, but used to be Samhain, right? And that really is meant to be the cross-quarter, which astronomically is about 15 degrees Scorpio, but we celebrate it really around the same time, where the sun's at about 10 degrees, a little bit earlier even. So we don't really want to get into the history of why that shifted or why it might actually be more true for the sun's experience on the horizon. But part of the point here is that the sun, after in these lands like South Dakota, especially so far from the equator, the sun, after having been very extremely far, rising south of east, in winter, setting south of west, taking a low arc through the sky. Now it's coming back. We're coming into the spring, and the flowers are blooming. So one thing I love to add about this fixed sign of Taurus is, I like to say with the fixed sign, is a bit of fix yourself to fix the world. There's a bit of like, how can I shift me to shift the world? And I love to say that Taurus is beauty is a spiritual practice. If we can really connect to the earth, Taurus is an earth sign, to the body, the senses, this is what the earth element speaks to. And really, Taurus is about living the simple way, right? And so we're speaking about a people who lived with the land. I don't even want to say off the land, right? They lived with the land and with the horse by this time, and with the buffalo and the antelope and the elk, and they treat and speak of these animal tribes as their brothers and sisters, as nations themselves. And I don't want to speak if that's my own experience, but this is very important. And this is a very Taurus thing. This is a very earth sign thing. I like to say Taurus really isn't the bull. It should be the cow, because the earth signs are known as feminine. And when we heard, as we did in episode 1, this calling of Lakota to bring us back to the grandmother-led tradition, the matriarchal tradition, there's something I feel about honoring the truth of Taurus as cow. Maybe we could even say buffalo. And I don't know if there's a name for buffalo females versus buffalo males. But I will say White Buffalo Lady is a very important figure in the Lakota tradition. And I, again, don't have the experience to speak from that wisely. So I will stop there and encourage you to open that window of your own. But I see and feel all of this in the bright, blooming light of the Taurus sun on this chart.
Yeah, it's beautiful. You know, the moon being exalted in Taurus, I think, speaks to that grandmother tradition that is very powerful in this nation. And also the idea that the other planet associated with Taurus, is the ruler of Taurus, is Venus. And Venus is traditionally goddess of beauty and also goddess of peace and love and harmony. Yeah, this is a peace treaty. So once again, I think that both on a very earthy, practical level of being, you know, a very fertile and fecund sign, and also on the level, the more abstract level of being about a peace treaty and of settling a dispute over the ownership of land, which is really a white man's concept, a white people's concept. Ownership of land is foreign to these people. They only know that they were the ones who controlled the land in terms of, you know, they hunted and lived on it because they were strong enough to run off anyone who tried to move them off of it, you know. So it wasn't necessarily ownership as much as, and I don't know what they would call it, but I would call it, you know, stewardship. They were the current stewards of they were the people who held that space, if you will. In New Age terms, we talk about holding space. You know, they were holding this space on Mother Earth at this time being. But yeah, you know, Taurus, I think, is just amazing archetype to symbolize indigenous people and as well as the action of a peace treaty.
Yeah, beautifully said, brother. And yeah, I want to add just a few things about bringing in the sky piece here. In our first episode, Gary mentioned Indian astrology, and he was not speaking about the First Nations of America. He was speaking about India. Yeah, so one of the issues with calling Native Americans Indians is this was a mistake we are taught, at least in history, by someone who thought they landed in a different place. I'm not necessarily sure that's true anyway, but regardless, the point is there's a rich astrological tradition known as the Jyotish tradition. Most people call it the Vedic tradition these days in India. And they have a different zodiac. And just to make this very brief, they start with a star, where we, with tropical astrology, known typically as Western astrology, start with the spring, or key it to, many say the seasons, although I'm finding to rectify the difference between the seasons in northern and southern hemispheres, that actually the thing is directional and that it's tied to the tilt of the earth. And that's not for today in any way, or probably for this series, but I'm working with some engineers right now to create some models to show this. So I'll be putting that out otherwise. And
it's the place where the ecliptic crosses the equator. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we're going to see that in space a little bit here, because I want to bring this, and I just bring that different zodiac to bear, because for the Vedic tradition currently, it's 24 degrees off from the tropical tradition. And see, I'm having a hard time doing two things at once, which is rare for me. But so, and like if I even shift this from the tropical zodiac to what's called the sidereal zodiac, well, I don't know that I can even do it. Whatever. The sun would be in Aries. And that I don't really want to share that. I don't know why I am, but just to give as a caveat that when we look through the sun in space, it is also aligned to the constellation known as Aries, or the constellation that I like to call the Ram. Okay. So this is where the sun was at this time, April 29th, 1868. And this is a very bright and important star of the sky. One more thing I'll share before we go there is I want to...
Hamal, yeah.
Hamal, yeah. So I'm going to bring in this other line, which is called the galactic, no, the, where are you? The equator. And we'll see that this crossing point of this blue line and the red line, this is 0 Aries, the tropical system. So Jupiter is very close to what's called the vernal equinox point, and we'll be speaking about that when we speak about Jupiter. But for now, over here in tropical Taurus, the sun is very strongly aligned to Hamal. So Gary, could you please tell us more about the star mysteries of that bright star?
Right. Well, in the Western tradition, of course, the Ram has a wonderful tradition as being this spiritual being that once rescued the children and took them to. It was a flying ram, by the way. This is not just any ram, but it rescued the children and took them to another place when they were, and then it was also a golden ram, right? The fleece was golden, and this fleece was deposited in a sacred grove, and later the warrior Jason came and retrieved that. So it's connected with the warrior energy, right? The ram, very much connected with warrior energy. If you go back even to Egypt, you'll see these ram heads being connected with also leadership energy, I believe. And so, but it's basically a very forthright energy. Hamal is known to be a very bold and forthright star. And these were extremely bold and forthright people. They were really probably, I mean, and this is of course a judgment from my point of view, having been removed by, I was born 100 years after this treaty. But it sounds like to me they were the badasses of the central United States region. They were very powerful, strong warriors. As far as I know, they're the only tribe that was actually growing in number during this period, where a lot of tribes were getting, and they handed a couple of the worst defeats to the United States Army that they've ever encountered in conflicts with Native people, right? One of the encounters, I think the Native people call it the 100 Hands conflict or something like that. They basically did away with about 100 of the U.S. warriors in this one conflict during Red Cloud's War. So yeah, you can see both, right? You can see, wow, on the one hand, and this is actually, from a different tribe, from a different nation, I think it's the Hopi. They talk about, the beauty way and the warrior way, right? So that they would literally, when you hear about Native people being on the warpath, that's literally like, when they're making war, they act a certain way. When they're at home with their own people, they act peaceful, right? There's literally two paths that a person can be walking. So we can see these two energies, Taurus and Aries, showing us these two sides of these same people. They were incredibly fierce warriors who were able to kick the snot out of the U.S. cavalry.
Absolutely.
At the same time, they were incredibly peaceful people who were able to live in a way with Stone Age technology. They were able to live, as you say, with the land in a way that none of us could do,
Yeah, absolutely. And this is cool, just living in the two ways with the chart as well. So I didn't say it so eloquently before, but there are these different zodiacs, and that's not what I'm about so much. I mean, there's a little tension, I think, in our community once again, because there's this whole 13 sign movement, and your star sign's actually not real. And we don't need to go into that here. Again, I'm going to be bringing out some videos about that and what the directional zodiac is another time. And I don't even want to get Gary started about that because we could speak for hours. But the point is, there is an energy of Taurus. There is a sign, a geometrical relationship. As for me, it emanates from the core of the earth. And that's a directional and tropical and experientially seasonal thing. However, there's also the star alignment. And so it's so beautiful, as Gary's speaking, to see this Taurus sun, but also to see it aligned to the Ram. I mean, we will certainly see Aries, Mercury, and maybe especially Mars, Jupiter, Neptune. Okay, so we'll see Aries coming into the scene from the tropical astrological perspective as well. I'd like to add a couple of things just mythologically. So the golden fleece that Gary mentioned, this saved the child Phrixus, who is going to be sacrificed on an altar by a very evil king. And
Yes.
he and his twin sister Helis were taken by the golden ram that was created by Hermes to save them. Yeah. And also in Kemet, or in Egypt, the ram-headed god, it said, is the one that created human, and also out of clay, which is true to many of the traditions. And hearing about Red Bull is very interesting, yeah, with this kind of Hamal energy. And this has actually surprised me just in my research for this project the last couple of days, to hear that this treaty, this Second Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, was in response to the United States Army basically having it handed to them by these brave warriors. And that's not the impression I was given in school, you know?
Right.
It was like, oh yeah, sorry about the genocide and stuff, but here's some land for you guys. Here, no, this was like us, like, you know, whatever we can give to you, please, let's have peace. Yeah. So it's something that we'll speak about this further as we kind of look at the evolving chart through time. But it's something I really encourage folks to look into. And again, I think in all of these episodes, I'll be linking a few different documentaries and things that I come around as I research personally. And if you have things to share, please leave them in the comments here on YouTube so we can learn more about this. And people of the First Nations, if you watch this, please educate me. Please share. All right, so let's take it to the Leo moon, Gary. And even before we speak about first quarter moon, we can just speak about what is a Leo moon. And one thing that I love that you mentioned before was this energy of stewards of the land.
Yes.
Something that I often associate with the archetype of Leo, which has a royalty, a radiance, yeah, a confidence, creative artist of our own life's experience, through true pride. You know, people think of pride as arrogance, but no, lions, Leo, roll in prides, you know. This is a proud and honorable people with a fiery tradition who were rightful stewards of the land. They wouldn't consider themselves, my understanding, as some kings and queens. Certainly there were chiefs and elders and grandmothers, as we're, you know, being encouraged to remember. But there's a true essence in Leo where the king or the queen or the royalty or the leadership knows that their greatest calling is to be in service to the land itself.
Yeah. And think about that word that you used there for a moment, sovereign, right? I mean, think about the relationship that the First Nations have with the U.S. government. They're sovereign nations, okay? And what does that mean exactly? That means that they are royal in a sense. A sovereign in sense of a person is the leader, the sovereign, the highest leader, right? So a king or a queen is a quote, sovereign. And the United States was founded on the philosophical principle that the people are the sovereigns. We don't have a king or queen, that the people are the rulers, and the government is formed through other people that we elect to serve as our representatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it could be argued, and we don't need to go into all the how that has gone horribly wrong. But the idea of sovereignty, and that these people were so fiercely proud that they said, no, you're going to deal with us as sovereign people, right? This is very much a Leo trait, because Leo is ruled by the sun. It's the hottest time of year. It is like that kind of fire that you get when you stoke up a wood stove, and it just, boom, it just radiates and it heats the entire house, or a brick oven when you're baking bread, that radiant heat that just cooks and heats a huge space, and it takes a long time for that heat to dissipate. Yeah, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about an ability to, again, a fixed sign. It's the middle of summer, right? So we're talking about midsummer energy, that tremendous hot, fiery energy of summer that is just baking the land. And from a anthropomorphic point of view, that this is the radiant heart. This is a brave-hearted people who demand to be dealt with as sovereigns. I did a little bit of reading on the history of this, and I believe Red Cloud walked away from the negotiations one time before this treaty could finally be signed, because he didn't think he was being dealt with honorably.
Or knew he wasn't, right?
Yeah.
I'll also put a link here in the descriptions where you can read the Fort Laramie Treaty in full. And there's some very interesting windows we can travel into there. So we're looking at a Taurus sun and a Leo moon. We spoke about the sun being here in the middle degrees of Taurus around May Day or Beltane, or the cross quarter between vernal equinox, spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, and summer solstice. And this Leo moon, where it is at the Lammas point, or this comes around August 1st, where we celebrate harvest, or really abundance, right? The hottest time of the year. So there's that radiant heat that we feel with Leo. And interestingly, it's said that the moon is exalted in Taurus, where this sun lives, and that the sun rules Leo, where this moon is. So in a way, they're living in each other's zones or houses. And this angle that connects them, which we'll speak about next, it comes into connecting them energetically. And they're set in some traditions and not in others, because one is in the other sign's exaltation and one is the other sign's domicile, that they share a mutual reception.
Yeah, the sun is receiving the moon here. This is the sun's territory, Leo, and the moon is forming in the act of forming an aspect with the sun that we call a square. And so there's a relationship here that the sun is saying, welcome to my abode. Let me give you all of the things that I can give you. And there were, again, as a treaty, in terms of, the bigger whole and the incredibly dishonorable dealings that the United States has had with the indigenous people, when I look at it, I think this was not a horrible treaty. If we had stuck to it, I think it would have been one that was, not all that bad. There were provisions for actually, for food and stuff besides the land, right? So that, there was some reception going on, I think, in the language of the treaty, if it had been honored. But yeah, so you have this, it's a powerful connection between the sun and the moon to be in each other's places. And I think it shows a powerful connection between the Sioux Nation and the land itself, as well as a powerful connection between um, the different bands of the Sioux Nation itself, as well as a powerful connection between the Sioux Nation and the other nations. I mean, um, I think the Cheyenne and the Arapaho were also involved in this treaty. And it's interesting because right now at Standing Rock, there are all kinds of tribes that are, what are they? They're being received, right? The Standing Rock people are saying, come, camp with us, join our camp, join our movement, right? And not just to other native people, but you and I could go there and be received if we honor their ways, right? And one of them, of course, is nonviolence is really important, and no alcohol, of course, and no weapons. If we can be mindful of these, if we can be mindful of these precepts, we can also come and be received. So I think it's really interesting that you point out that reception there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard for me not to interrupt, as I almost did there, because when I hear about no alcohol and no weapons, one thing we'll see as we're looking through the history is how alcohol has been used as a weapon.
Yeah.
Vision, and how literally quotes of "we need to get these people" saying mine instead of our, and knowing about ownership and these kinds of things. So when we talk about going out there and being invited there, it's as if our tribe, is invited if we are willing to live. And I would, add not just in their ways, but in the true ways, in the ways of the land. Yeah. And so this is something that we're hoping to spread here, is just this message for us to tune into what the elders are teaching us so that we can all learn from this. It's an amazing opportunity. And in so many ways, it's been foretold by prophecies here in America and abroad, and also of the astrological prophecies and in some of the planetary alignments that are happening now, and also alignments that are bringing our consciousness to an evolution of something in a way that was planted in the 60s and long ago. And so we'll be looking at this as we cruise through these episodes. I don't know that I'll be able to have Gary's time for everyone, hopefully so, but we'll see how that goes. So Gary, let's look at this Leo moon in the sky as well, and then we'll talk about that square aspect and the phase of the moon. But here we are. So this Leo moon at this time is right here in the claws of the crab.
Yes.
I also want to we'll go into this in another episode when we speak more about Venus, but I want to show this area of the sky, which to my understanding was known as the sacred hoop to the Lakota, and it's had many different names over time. The astronomers these days call it the winter hexagon, which is Capella, this star of the charioteer or the herdsman, Castor and Pollux of the Gemini twins, Procyon the little dog, Sirius the brightest star, the big dog, Rigel the left foot of Orion, Aldebaran the eye of the bull, or some as the Lakota did use the Pleiades, which sit on the bull's back, and Venus being right here in the Milky Way and right here, as the Celts would say, on the hand of the high man is very significant. But it's very interesting to me how the sun and the moon are embracing this sacred hoop. And as I'll show in future episodes, how this sacred hoop was also mapped onto sacred land of the Black Hills in South Dakota, and not by human hand. So, but for now, what about the moon being in the hand of the crab, Gary?
Right. Well, the crab is not an easy constellation to see visually. So right away, to me, that says that its messages are more subtle and more, right? Because if something is physically harder to see, then it's philosophically a little bit more subtle, right? But the idea basically of the crab is that it's a defensive kind of creature that holds on to things with its. So I literally have the crab. It's in the crab's claw, right? And the crab grabs things with the claw. So there's there's an attempt to this. It's interesting because this was really a defensive move by the U.S. government to kind of, again, there's an act of acculturation here going an acculturation going on here, because, you know, here, have some land, like live like us, right? Take ownership of a specific piece of land bordered by, you know, rivers like we do, right? So it's almost like forcing our way of thinking on them in one way, but it's also, you know, that there's a grabbing, you know, action going on in that sense. And then if we look at it from the sense of the Lakota people, right? The crab is like associated with nurturing, mothering, kind of, right? It's the crab lives in the tidal region, right? Which is where all life began on this planet, right? It didn't begin in the ocean proper. It didn't begin on land. It began in that liminal place between the ocean and the land. So there's this very fertile, mothering energy that I think the crab represents, that speaks to that whole grandmother tradition in a way too, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not too far from the honeybee cluster, right?
Yeah.
So if we think about royalty, and especially a matrilineal leadership, the grandmothers, the council of grandmothers, I mean, think about how the beehive works. Yeah, the beehive cluster. And just the amazing hexagrams and geometry of bees, like the shamanic way of the bee is something that I really encourage people to read. They are such great teachers, and this is part of the awareness that's happening right now, right? That the bees are dying because of our environmental crimes that have been going on, and so the water becomes this amazing voice and this amazing calling. But we're also talking about the sacred land in all ways. Another thing, we could speak about the crab forever, but one thing about crabs too is they move sideways. Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why I believe they were originally kind of seen as this animal that speaks to summer solstice, because at the summer solstice, the sun stops its northerly direction where it rises further and further north on the horizon throughout spring. Once we get to summer solstice, it stops. Solstice means the stopping of the sun, and now it starts coming back. You can even see that in the old ways, and so this is confusing because we're speaking about tropical Leo, but constellational Cancer, but they used to be one and the same. And if you look at that glyph of Cancer, one is the sun moving this way and the other is the sun moving back, you see. And there's a beautiful balance there, but there's also a little sideways dealing, and there's also a little claw going on here. And no doubt that has shown itself. And even though the sun and the moon have this reception, which traditionally we would see very beautifully as this exchange of energetic, like the moon is calling upon the sun to get its goods, or like it's living in the sun's house. So, hey, what are these books about? What should I read? Where should I eat? You know, I like to think of it in this way. But this square aspect, this 90-degree alignment between the two, is said to be tense.
Yes. Yeah.
And I want to actually show that in space. I'm going to open another program here called Solar System Scope, because this is a really interesting thing about the square aspect in general that's been coming in for me in my meditations as I've been contemplating this directional zodiac. Because the thing is, it's true that the constellations and the signs don't agree for tropical astrology. In fact, the constellations and the signs, no matter what system you use, if you have a 12-sign equal zodiac, they can never agree. And again, I'll speak more about that in other videos. But in a directional zodiac, we can really feel into these essences of the square. So I've personally, in my own path, recently been working on this musically. Like I've been playing the aspects, as they're called, on the piano. And then also looking at this from a directional standpoint. Okay, so when we mean square, the whole point is if we could draw a square in the chart like this, and it would go through signs of the same, what are called modality, all right? So the fixed signs, as Gary mentioned, Taurus is a fixed sign, Leo is a fixed sign, also Scorpio and Aquarius. And so if there were Scorpio and Aquarius energies here, we would basically make a full square. The square, just like the corner of a square, is a 90-degree aspect. And it's not perfect here. Perfect would be 9 degrees, 24 minutes, Leo. That definitely happened during the course of this day, that the moon, which is what's called closing into this aspect, because the moon moves faster than the sun. So the moon's going to come into perfection. I can tell you exactly what time that happened that day, actually, using Intrepid, which is brilliant. We can just say, okay, when did the moon square the sun? Or I could have just hit this first quarter moon button. And that was at 11:35 a.m., okay? And this very much might have been happening during the signing of this treaty. Again, we're using a sunrise chart because we don't have an exact time. Now, if I show this to you in the sky, I can't rewind this to 1868, unfortunately, because Solar System Scope, at least the version I downloaded, stops at 1900. But I just want to show this. I mean, we know this about the moon, but this is coming into nature as well. All right, so the moon, right, that's new moon. Every month when the moon comes between Earth and sun. This is what's happening on the chart that we're looking at for Standing Rock. This is the waxing half moon, but it's also known as a first quarter moon, not only because it's on a square. You can see how the moon is here and the sun is here, right? So 90 degrees, but it's a quarter way through the cycle. When the next principal phase we know is full moon, when the moon is opposite the sun from the Earth's point of view. And then the third quarter moon, the waning half moon, as we come back into the next moon or the next cycle, new moon, right? What I want you to see here is look at how the Earth in this moment is moving this way and the moon is moving this way, right? So that square, it also brings the tension of perpendicularity, you see. So, I mean, the worst accident you can get in on cars, right, or otherwise, is head-on collision.
Oh, yeah.
You have a time to speak a prayer because unless you fell asleep at the wheel or you're just way out of it or texting, right?
Yeah.
But this thing, it's coming out of nowhere. It might be good for your body because you're loose because you don't know what's happening, maybe.
Yeah.
But it just takes you surprise. And there's a little bit of that in a square energy. It's like they have this perpendicularity and the friction happens like this, but this is like a whole nother thing, yeah?
Yeah, it really is a very tense aspect. And because there's a few ways to additionally think about this. We think about the fixed energy being, the manifesting or the holding of the fruit of that season. Well, are we going to hold the fruits of spring or are we going to hold the fruits of summer? Because those are different fruits, yeah? If we try to take the fruits of spring and put them in the middle of summer environment, they're going to wither. It's going to, and vice versa, right? So it's like, usually the square is associated with choice because it's like, well, we could do one or we could do the other, but doing them simultaneously is a bit difficult. But also, as you said, it's the first crossroads. When you look at the moon is round. But you see this hard, flat edge on a first quarter moon. This hard, flat edge, you don't see that in nature except in the sky. You don't really see straight lines in nature, but you see it in a first quarter moon. And I think that hard edge speaks to that, I would say a growth challenge, right? There's a challenge in the evolution of something when it reaches this first quarter, to make a choice about which way it's going to go. And I think that speaks abundantly to the choice that Red Cloud was making at this time, which was to accept the peace and not continue to wage war, and it was a choice that he stayed with to his dying day. He died on the reservation. He didn't fight anymore. It was the other leaders, the other Lakota leaders, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, that took up the fight later. But I think also it doesn't just speak in that moment that Red Cloud was making a choice, but the Lakota people hadn't always been stewards of this particular spot on the earth, right? They had come from further over towards the Great Lakes, or what we call the Midwest, and the people that they displaced had come from there too.
Yeah.
So that's the way that the native culture worked, is it was constantly flowing, one tribe might be right here right now, but they might have come from over here. And then if another tribe pushes them out, they might go over here, you know, so there was this constant flow. So really it had only been, you know, maybe a couple hundred years that the Lakota people had been right here. And also what's really fascinating is that it had only been a relatively short, in terms of history, time that they had been people of the horse. Because the horse, of course, came over from Europe, you know, with the Spanish conquistadors and stuff. So you can see this evolutionary growth choice happening on a few different levels. On the level of, you know, Red Cloud having to make a choice in how to deal with the United States, and the Lakota culture in general having to make a choice in how they were going to survive.
Yeah, you know, the Taurus sun really feels to me of this buffalo, right? So this like abundance, this living simply, this living with the land, this understanding that this is a nation, the buffalo tribe, but they're in relation, right? Where they also provide food and warmth and, you know, and it's a mutual relationship, yeah?
Yeah.
For Leo, I mean, one of the great energies, I have a deer here. This is from the Weechel tribe, yeah. And it's very much kind of like stag elk deer. There's a power here, but the horse carries that royal energy as well. And especially when it's not treated as some like subject, yeah. When you witness the native people with the horse, it's different than some kind of saddle and bridle, you know, pony show, right? I mean, or dominance. There's this relationship. It's almost like the centaur, and we'll be speaking about Chiron as we move along here too. So to kind of start wrapping up, I guess, for this sun and moon episode, you know, I'd just like to share also, we spoke about the sun as the giving light and as the life force and as the energy. And in so many ways, there's like an essence of identity there. But the moon carries more of, it's been said where the sun carries more of that yang, that light giving, the moon is more receiving and reflective, more of the yin energy. But I also say, I love that in shamanic astrology, mystery school, Daniel Jamario's school, and I don't think this is brand new when I read into some of the, between the lines in some of the old writings, that the moon is kind of seen as a lineage place. It's seen as where we're coming from. There's this essence for me, more and more as I learn from sacred geometry, sun is spirit and moon is soul. And so in modern times we'll feel like it's the emotional base or your memories or subconscious, but all these things, there's mother in some of the older astrologies, but these are all things that either speak of how I came in or where I come from. So there's this essence with the Leo moon of a royal, a sovereign, a lineage, a radiant leadership, and even with the Leo moon, maybe this matriarchal or feminine leadership, the Council of Grandmothers.
Yes.
But with the horse and the warrior, again, just as you mentioned with the Taurus sun, but aligned to the ram.
Yes.
So we had this Leo moon, but aligned to the crab.
Yes.
And there's that way of being in both realms. And so this is just an invitation also to astrologers. I think sometimes because the signs and the constellations don't align, people decide not to look anymore. Like it's going to just destroy their beliefs.
Yeah.
Where actually the entire new realms of the experiential world open when you honor that there are directional or tropical or seasonal signs and stars. And then that's where that marriage of heaven and earth is where it comes from. So I'm not sure if this is for today, Gary. I'm going to let you decide. I'm going to share the screen here and just show that very importantly, we've also got this moon, well, in trine to Jupiter. I'm trying to remember who was over here in
Saturn.
Oh, Saturn, right? Thank you. Saturn and Sagittarius making what's called the Grand Fire Trine.
Yes.
We can look at the sun in conjunction to Pluto, perhaps. And, you know, I think this is not for today. And maybe we'll start there next time, or even look at all of the different planets and then bring in some more of these aspects later. But the idea, and I think what we can learn from this phase of the moon, is that all of these geometries, like this 120 degree alignment, which is almost perfect for moon and Saturn, or this one from Moon and Jupiter, they speak not only of these geometries, and when we look at this or this, right, they literally have energetic participation in the geometries, and this is aspect that has been known about for a long time in astrology, and it really keys in, I'm finding more and more, to musical harmony and so much of nature, that it's about nature. But it also speaks to the cycle, because just like the moon will wax into the half moon here and then wax into a full moon when it's opposite the sun and wane into the waning half or the third quarter moon, there's also a relationship between Moon and Jupiter. Moon had seen Jupiter about 9 or 10 days before this. They met here, right? And we'll see Saturn in about 9 or 10 days. So when we look at these geometries, we're also speaking about evolving relationship between these planets. And
Right.
things that don't have like a very solid geometry that will show up in the chart, there is a relationship between that planet. And the relationship between the planets and us, we will find more and more as we honor not only where they were in the sky, what constellations they're aligned to, as we've seen a bit today, but also where they are in their own particular cycle with the giving light of the sun by phase. And we're fortunate to have Gary Caton here because he's an absolute specialist in this regard. In fact, he's writing the books on Mercury. So maybe next time we can talk a little about Mercury and Venus and Mars.
Yeah, and some more of these cycles, yeah, because it's important to understand that although although this 4-quarter, lunar phase can be seen to somewhat mirror the 4 quarters or the 4 seasons of the solar phase with the Earth, that all cycles are not exactly the same, right? We don't want to say, just like all nations, for instance, all indigenous people are not the same, right? The Lakota were different than the Cheyenne, and the Cheyenne were certainly different from the Iroquois, woodland people. These, the different cycles are, do different things. But at the same time, this idea that of cycles in and of themselves show us, the container of what was going on, before and after this moment that we're focusing on, right? As you said, the moon was moving from a relationship with Jupiter towards a relationship with Saturn in this chart, so that we get a sense of where something's coming from and where it's going through these cycles. And I think that is really a huge gift that astrology can give us, is that it can show us, we can put on, like a photographer, essentially different lenses, right? So we can look at something from a macro or a little bit bigger lens, or this huge lens, for if we want to zoom out and get like a fisheye view or whatever. But yeah, that'll be fun. That'll definitely be something that we can get into with the cycles with the various planets. And
absolutely, yeah, and I'm thinking, not today, but that we should also, maybe even before speaking about Mercury and Venus and Mars, to speak about the lunar nodes and lunar latitude. But also, it's really important to me when I honor these things as circles, and I love bringing this to people. Yeah, you have a Taurus sun. Yes, you have a Leo moon, but where was the new moon before this birth? And
yes.
we're going to find that this one, in fact, was in Taurus. But see, here it's in 3 degrees Taurus, not 9.5 degrees Taurus. And for me, this is a very active point on this chart, even though if I bring in all the birth planets for this chart and a bunch of asteroids and other things I love to look at, we're not going to see that degree, right? But it's there, because that's where the seed of the meeting of moon and sun was.
Yes.
For me, soul and spirit, that's where they came together. I mean, when do we come together to plant our seeds of intentions as spiritual communities and whatnot? That's at the time of the new moon, of literally planting seeds within. So a seed was planted, though we don't see it on this chart, in this 3rd degree of Taurus. And I might, in another episode down the road, we'll see if Gary wants to join this one or not, but I might also look at these times, which was, this is a lunar eclipse before this birth on March 8th, 1868. This is what's called the prenatal solar eclipse. Okay, this was a absolutely total solar eclipse. It wasn't seen in South Dakota, and I can show you where in the world it was seen, and maybe we'll talk about those kinds of themes. But for next time, I think we'll get into a little bit about what the lunar nodes are, what nodes are in general, and speak about how that can show us lunar latitude, because this is something that's often lost to astrology and carries just another very key living experiential component.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So yeah, you have these cycles that we can, even though we're looking at this one moment for this treaty, we can still look forward and backward in time and see how that's also informing this moment. And we can also look at, you know, where the moon is going in terms of a vertical dimension too, as you've talked about with latitude, you know, with respect to those nodes. Those nodes are literally interface points, right? So she has and the moon has an interface with the Earth's orbit, right? And all the planets have their own particular interface with the Earth's orbit. So if we understand things within the context of that interface, we get a sense of where they're coming and where they're going. Once again, that gives us context and frames of reference to see, to flesh out a little bit more of what this symbology feels and looks like, and so forth.
We'll find some really interesting context there. And our intent here is not only to work in this astrological way as like prayer, because as we're honoring Standing Rock and what's happening there, is we look through the lens of this Western medicine, as I've heard Gary call it, this you know, astrological lens. We are also connecting ourselves there and hopefully spreading some awareness to you, and also hopefully teaching a bit about our craft and the way that we work with it. So these beautiful things about honoring the cycles, and maybe you've done this on your own chart if you follow astrology, or maybe not, but you're zooming out of the frame of the film that is you. Very important. I like to say your birth chart is your song. You know, it shows your soundtrack and invites you to dance, fate, and free will. But also it's a frame of a film, and you can zoom out to see this scene. Yeah, so for me personally, Scorpio sun, Gemini moon, but in a Libra cycle, the Libra new moon before my birth, you see. And that was the scene that my frame is part of. And Gary, again, is a specialist in this shamanic astrology, where I first started my study, really brings what's called these synodic cycles to bear. So we look forward to sharing that and many other things. And if you have questions or you want to know more, leave a comment below. I would also love to honor, as this is one of the challenging things that comes in astrology sometimes, and I don't think this is the time to answer the question, Gary, but to pose it, is that what do you do with twins? Why are they so different if they have the exact same chart? Now, they might be born minutes apart, and that would make them different in ways. Yes. But at the same time, it's a good question. And here, in a sense, we do have twins, right? We're looking at this chart as, in a sense, a birth chart or a world chart for the Standing Rock Reservation. It's also the chart for the Fort Laramie Treaty. Very different entities. Now, if I cast this for the Fort Laramie Treaty, I would cast it at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, instead of Standing Rock, South Dakota, and we will see differences there. We might even go there during the course of this journey. But it's pretty interesting to think about these two totally different entities and how can we apply one chart to them, to these twins, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, in other words, the fate and free will comes into play, and also cultural frame of reference, right? So I can interpret a chart through a fatalistic lens that, you know, this says everything that's going to happen to you, or I can interpret that chart in that, you know, in terms of, well, certain things are going to happen at certain times, and you're going to have a menu of choices and how to deal with that. And I can also interpret it from the lens of, like you said, two very different cultures, and come up with two very different stories, of course. And that's the beautiful thing about this, is that it's multivalent. Yeah, multiple truths are that we can see.
Absolutely. And it's a moment in time of the universal expression. One word that we mentioned with Leo is sovereignty, as Gary brought in. Another is honor. Yeah. So
Yeah.
here are two entities on other sides of this treaty. In fact, many, because many tribes were involved. But if we think about the Native Americans, the First Nations, and then this United States, yeah, there are two opposite sides that could have honored this treaty. And that's not what happened. And so part of that we might see in this tension, in this square between a Taurus sun and a Leo moon, even though there's mutual reception. And so looking forward to exploring this more and more with all of you, and with you, Gary. Thank you so much for spending your time here. And again, if you have comments or you want to come chime in, or if you want to know more about something that we touched upon, please just leave a note in the comments below, or you can find us online, and we're going to continue taking this further. So thank you for joining us.
Aho.
Aho! See you in space.